I'm going to change up my introduction a little bit this morning. Normally I kind of begin you off with a story or an illustration or something, but I want to go straight to the text this morning. This comes from Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. Then, passing by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the toll booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and he followed him. While he was reclining at the table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who were following him. When the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, he asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "It is not those who are well that need a doctor, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." We began last week kind of walking through, and we're going to do this over the summer, the stories that we see in Mark and kind of just making our way through. And I told you last week that 90% of Mark can be found in Matthew. And so I want to read for you this passage also from Matthew, and I want you to see there's a little bit of a difference here, and I want you to catch the statement that Jesus makes. As Jesus went out from there, he saw a man named Matthew, Levi, Matthew, same guy, sitting at the toll booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. While he was reclining at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and the sinners?" And when he heard this, he said, "It is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." How many of you have heard this passage preached in a sermon before, or maybe you've heard this passage preached multiple times before? I think for a lot of us who have church ties at all, this is a big one. This is one that we've heard many times. In fact, interestingly enough, this is a sermon, or at least this is a passage from Scripture that has defined so much of the Christian movement for hundreds and thousands of years. Funny enough, Gandhi, who wasn't even a believer, loved this story. It's part of the reason Gandhi makes the statement, "I like your Christ, I don't like your Christians." And we'll get to that comment here in just a little bit. But interestingly enough, and this is part of the way that I was raised, I remember hearing this story so many times, and there was this quick jump, this quick leap to just absolutely condemn the Pharisees and the scribes in this passage. And I want to ask, before we quickly make that jump, is there even a little bit of us that can identify with the Pharisees, with why they would react with such harsh, we got to separate ourselves? Now let's do some contextual work here, particularly for Matthew and this Levi character that we're not used to hearing about. Matthew writes the gospel. This is his gospel, okay? Now I know we're walking through Mark, but this is the guy who writes Matthew's gospel. And he's probably working for this guy named Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was one of the three sons of Herod the Great. And when Herod the Great died, he split up the kingdom of Israel into basically three different parts, giving his three sons one region to rule. And what would take place in order for these three men to get rich is they would set up tax booths or toll booths so that when you crossed from one region to the other region, you had to pay a toll. Okay? And they would get rich off of this. And these first century Israelites, most of them, many of them, would have been old enough to remember a time that there wasn't a toll to pay. And every single time a new tax is passed, who are the people that get griped about? The tax collectors. Welcome to our world today. I don't know a lot of people who work for the IRS that were like, "Yeah, stand-up guy," you know? And we tend to look at tax collectors in the IRS as, "You're the people working for the government who steal all of my income." And yet, part of the reason, at least part of the reason that Levi or Matthew was disliked is because he worked for the Herodians, for all of these Herods. And these Herods were like puppets for the Roman Empire. And because they were puppets for the Roman Empire, they were placed in this situation of oversight over Israel, and they got rich off of Israel. So effectively what you have taking place is you have Levi working for the foreign government. He has taken a job that assists a foreign empire in oppressing his own people. Think about that for a moment. It's no wonder nobody liked him. It's no wonder people didn't care to be around him. And yet at the same time, when you work a job like this, you either go home super alone and living in total depression, or you make friends with people who are probably also unsavory characters. And so here is this guy hanging out with people that the spiritual leaders of his day would look at and go, no. We don't hang out with people like that. And there's no reason your rabbi, your teacher, there's no reason this guy who has kind of come onto the stage and he's teaching all sorts of things about God, there's no reason that he should be hanging out with them either. Hanging out with those types of people just sparks this true disgust in the eyes of true Israelites. And that's the word, isn't it? Disgust. When the Pharisees see Jesus hanging out with sinners, they are disgusted. Let's talk about that for just a moment. The psychology of disgust is really an interesting topic, okay? And for those of you who think I'm lying when I just say that out loud, let me bring you along and maybe I'll convince you. Scientists have stated for years that humanity is probably the only species on Earth that can loathe its own species. In the most simple of terms, disgust is to find something or someone totally offensive. And it is a strong and very reactionary feeling. Disgust regulates a ton of our lives, even daily lives, and whether you know it or not, or even contemplated it this morning when you got up, disgust drove many of us to prepare ourselves to come to church. Right? People who don't brush their teeth, we stand at a distance, don't we? People who don't take showers and use deodorant, we notice. Okay? And then you hear the comments, well, I have a sensitive nose. No, we all have a sensitive nose when people don't use deodorant, okay? You know? You start thinking about all the things that we find disgusting, whether it's particular foods or various animals. Sometimes it's sexual behaviors, touching a dead corpse, bodily fluids, poor hygiene. Sometimes it's even how people look. It's the contact or the being in contact with these types of, as I mentioned a moment ago, unsavory types of people and folks who participate in what we consider to be horribly immoral offenses. Disgust forces us to create boundaries between whatever or whoever it is that we find disgusting. We have to find and create some sort of safe space between us and them. And it's not just that we create space. If we feel threatened enough, we will expel them. Okay, we will push them away. We will even do that by force if necessary. We will create so much space that we'll even break relationships sometimes because we believe this situation is too disgusting for me. But in the midst of that, notice this, or maybe remember this. Children are not hardwired for disgust, you know? Kids aren't hardwired for disgust when they're born. That's why we have to teach our children, don't pick your boogers and eat them. Right? That's gross. That's nasty. And yet we still have to teach them. Or I can remember the first time our family got a dog, and Holden was like 3 years old, and I was like, dude, don't pick up the dog poop. Right? We're not hardwired for disgust. We teach even kids with our behavior how they should find certain things disgusting or people disgusting. kids have to learn by watching us, and what they learn in so many ways when they learn disgust from us is they begin to learn that disgust is quickly married to contamination. I don't know too many people who let their children go into a public bathroom barefoot. Yeah, already. There it is. Out of the mouths of babes right there. That's nasty, okay? And those of you who know me, you know I'm a germaphobe, okay? I love shaking your hands on Sunday mornings, and I am quick to find the sanitizer afterwards. I'm not going to lie. All right? I love to wash my hands. It's a good day for me when I get to wash my hands. I love it, okay? Paul Rosen, he's a social scientist. He did a lot of experimenting and data collection in this area. And on one occasion, he brings this group of people together. He cooks in front of them, or actually he cooked on video. On video, he cooks brownies, okay? You get to see the whole process take place. He cooks brownies. From start to finish, they get to watch this video, and this whole group of people who he's using for his science experiment are in front of this television, and they're watching this whole thing take place. And after he finishes, cooking, he changes gloves, he puts on a new pair of gloves so that everyone can see it, and he begins to form these brownies into what looks like poop. He puts it on a plate, and then he brings before this group of people the plate of perfectly fine brownies. You can imagine the response. Separately, in another situation, he made fresh lemonade. You know where this is going, okay? You already know where this is going. He made fresh lemonade in front of everybody and showed them, this is what I'm doing. You're seeing the whole process take place. And after he has finished making the lemonade, he gets a never-been-used, perfectly clean bedpan, puts the lemonade in the bedpan, gets a ladle, and begins to serve into cups for all of these people lemonade. People would not touch it. They were not about to drink the lemonade. They weren't about to eat the brownies, okay? Because it was immediately associated with contamination. They could not disassociate what they knew from what they thought in so many different ways. It was irrational. Richard Beck, who is a retired professor from Abilene Christian University, tells this analogy. He said, imagine I take you to my house and I open up an old box. And in this old box, I pull out all sorts of memorabilia that my grandfather had from his time in World War II. We go through all sorts of different things, and imagine you're a little bit like me, so you're a history dork, and you love it. So he's pulling out all of this memorabilia, and you're enjoying the stories that kind of come with it. And the next thing you know, he pulls out this old, tattered, dirty sweater. And he begins to tell you the story. He says this sweater belonged to Adolf Hitler. And based upon pictures, we have proof that Adolf Hitler wore this sweater the very week that he committed suicide as the Allies were encroaching in upon him. You want to put it on? You going to try it on? And he said, scientifically, we are formed to look at that and go, whoa, 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 whoa. No, I'm not putting that on. Not only am I not putting that on, I feel uncomfortable even being in the same room with this sweater that Hitler wore. We begin to cognitively and psychologically, irrationally associate the sweater with evil. And what we're worried about, and what people irrationally worry about, is that evil from Hitler somehow seeped into a sweater. And if I'm in the same room with that sweater, then that evil will seep out of that sweater and into me. It's as though evil is contagious. Rosen, going back to the first guy, He names 4 principles for perceiving a contagion. Let me walk you through this. This is crazy. First, we see contamination come through contact or physical proximity. We avoid being around the contagion. We just talked about this, the Hitler sweater, okay? That's number 1. The second one is really interesting. The second one is we see contagions in terms of dose insensitivity. Let me explain what that means. This means that even the smallest amount or the smallest percentage of something can be extremely harmful and even pollute the entirety of whatever the system is. Our logic, no matter how irrational, is that the smallest of pollutants can and will have catastrophic consequences. The dosage size is totally irrelevant in our minds. Okay? Third, we see contaminations in terms of permanence. Depending upon what it is, we worry that once something has been or once some person has been contaminated, there is nothing that can be done to purify or rehabilitate it or that person. If you're given a glass of water and someone puts 1 drop of urine in the glass of water, no matter how many times you see that water purified and go through the process of purification, most of us are not drinking that water, you know? Or go back to the dose and sensitivity for just a minute. How it doesn't matter how it ruins whatever it is. And the contamination of being in proximity to this. Some of you will remember this. I grew up loving basketball. I've loved basketball all my life. And I remember when everything got super public about Magic Johnson having the HIV virus. We had never seen a public athlete go through what he was going through at the time. And this is, again, think about this for just a moment. This is almost 30 years ago. You want to feel old? No one wanted to play against Magic Johnson. They were worried, other players were worried that if they got cut and he got cut and somehow they bumped into each other, everybody would end up with AIDS. And we also assumed in 1991, Magic Johnson was about to die because he had been permanently ruined by this disease. Fourth, this is the last one, we understand contamination in terms of negative dominance. When a pollutant and a pure object come in contact, the pollutant always wins. Always. If you give me my favorite drink, and again, put a drop of urine in my favorite drink, no matter what takes place in the mixing of these chemicals, there is no way in my mind you are going to get me to believe that all of a sudden that drop of urine is somehow delicious now. That's not going to win out. In fact, what my brain is going to tell me, and what my fear is going to tell me, is that not only is that not delicious, but it has now made my favorite drink not taste as good. Right? Come back to our story for just a moment. See, the Pharisees, they had never considered that Jesus' presence and his purity would overwhelm whatever was impure about those people. It had never dawned on them that the presence of the Christ was the strongest working force in that situation. And the truth of the matter is that Jesus is never contaminated by coming into contact with sinners and unclean people. In fact, they're the ones being consistently made pure. Being around a small or even a massive dose of sin does not contaminate Jesus. In fact, he takes the entirety of every single generation's sin upon himself. He defeats it, destroys it, and walks up out of the grave and says, "What's next?" Right? Bring it. because you did your worst with all of the worst possible things that evil could do, and I beat it. Not only did I beat it, but I'm giving you that victory over that very same contamination. He brings, if we're going to talk about permanence, Jesus never sees sin as permanent. Jesus brings permanent salvation through himself and by giving the world a kingdom way of living. Sin's permanent state from this point forward is that it just doesn't have any power. And Jesus is never outdone by negative dominance. When Jesus and sin are in the same place, he wins. When Jesus and sin are in the same place, he redeems and he purifies, and this is exactly what is taking place at Levi's table. A place that the spiritual leaders thought was overly contaminated with sin, and Jesus makes it pure. Now, I've been preaching long enough to know. I've been a somewhat self-aware human long enough to know that we hear a story like this and we're like, yes, like that's Jesus, that's great, but we know the preacher is about to talk about how we respond, right? I'm going to be real honest with you for the next couple of minutes. Christians have been notorious for responding to specific people and to specific segments of people with disgust. Here's the thing. When disgust is used to enlighten our understanding of God's goodness and God's holiness, hear this statement this morning. When disgust is used to enlighten and to give us understanding of God's goodness and God's holiness, the hospitality of the church dies. The hospitality of Jesus cannot exist with disgust. If sin is considered contagious, then real relationships and hospitable interactions cannot coexist. Grace and hope cannot exist in the same relationship when you look at someone with disgust. It can't happen. They cannot coexist. You have to pick one or the other. Either you choose hope and grace for someone, or you look at them with total disgust. They can't live together. And what you end up seeing when people try to merge these two things together is people are no longer people, they're a project to be fixed. And we think we've arrived at some sort of enlightenment because we're serving the people that we find disgusting. And yet at the same time, they're not people, they're a project. And we're only willing to serve them if the outcome looks like what we want it to look like. That makes them a project. And we keep working to fix them rather than be in relationship with them. Grace and hope cannot live in the same relationship with disgust. And there are a couple of major thoughts here I want to finish with. The first one is this, and it's the one that I think gets overlooked in this passage time and time again. I'll tell this story. I know a lady at a previous church who got pregnant when she was 19 years old. I'm not blaming anything when I tell you the rest of this story. I'm just simply saying this is her family dynamic and her church background, okay? So again, I'm not hammering anybody. Just saying here's what the situation is. She came from a very conservative church and a very conservative family. And in her mind, getting pregnant outside of wedlock at 19 was the most shameful thing she could possibly do. The most shameful thing. She was raised in a small community. And how in the world would she ever be remembered for anything amongst these 8,000 people except as the lady who got pregnant at 19? To make matters worse, she didn't get pregnant by her boyfriend. She got drunk one night at a party, had sex. Here's a kid. So she made the trek to a bigger city, to a private clinic, and she had an abortion. Let me tell you something that I know to be true, and if you argue with me, I will die on this mountain. There is nothing you can do that will make God look at you with disgust. Nothing. And the sad thing is we have people coming to church week in and week out, and we're not even, to be honest with you, they're not even worried about learning how to love other people. They cannot get past the fact that they feel nothing but shame sitting between them and our God. And I'm telling you right now, there is nothing that you can do that will ever make God look at you with disgust. Nothing. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ right there. There's nothing. And the truth of the matter is, what so many of us have sitting between us and God is an inability to allow God's forgiveness to teach us how to forgive ourselves. And I'm telling you right now, there is healing for those who only feel shame. It is not an easy process, but there is healing. And here's where the church comes in. We do not heap shame upon other people. That is not who we are. That is not what we do as the church. This is where you say amen. Okay. Either you're asleep or I'm about to look for another job. I don't know what's going on. All right? This is where the church comes in, and the church looks at anyone and everyone and says, you will not be treated with disgust. You will be treated with table fellowship. That is what the Lord's Supper teaches us. You are not treated with disgust. You are welcomed to the table. One, because it's not my table. It's His. And I gather around that table with you because I believe Jesus is the healer of all healers. And I needed the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus as much as anyone else. Period. We do not use disgust and shame against others. We are the people who constantly use hope and grace as our greatest weapons in this world because it disarms sin. It disarms brokenness. And we use it over and over and over again because we believe that the strongest force in the world is not sin, it's the love of God. That was also where you say amen. I want to pray for us, and we're going to have one more song.